The three stories in our Bible readings this week tell us that God is for us today and not only in the past. He journeys with us through the challenges that the modern world lays before us and helps us to navigate our way through that tortuous maze. Frequently, we read that Jesus and his disciples were challenged by the religious enthusiasts as to why they weren't doing what everyone else was doing. But Jesus and his disciples had reasons for why they were doing things differently. And Jesus refers to the story of King David in the Old Testament, persuading the priest Abiathar to give him the holy bread that was meant to be only for the priests. That was so that David and his young men could eat and have energy to keep ahead of King Saul and his soldiers who are chasing him. We often read that Jesus and his disciples didn't even have time to eat. In today's passage, we read that the disciples were seen picking ears of corn on the Sabbath, and no doubt eating them as they walked along. The Pharisees accused them of harvesting, which was work, and working on the Sabbath was forbidden. Jesus tells them that the Sabbath day is a day to benefit mankind, by encouraging them to take time out from the daily routine and instead spending time with God, family, and friends. For those who have to work on the Sabbath, whether that is Saturday or Sunday or every other day of the week, God doesn't condemn them. Instead, he encourages us to make time with him whenever we can and wherever we are. Indeed, we see Jesus making that time, even at the end of our reading today, when he sets off across the Sea of Galilee with his disciples in order to take some time out to rest and recharge and reflect on all that had been happening. Jesus points out to the Pharisees, that Jewish sect which put the observance of the religious rules above everything else. He points out to them that even the famous King David broke the religious rules when there was no other option to feed himself and his men. This took place before David had been made king. The previous King Saul was still on the throne, convinced that David was trying to steal the throne from him. King Saul took his most loyal soldiers and set out to kill David. When David is trying to persuade the priest Ahimelech to give them the holy bread, David even appears to bend the truth, if not actually make up an excuse to persuade Ahimelech the priest that David was on the king's business and had told David that no one else must know what he is doing. The priest gives David the bread, but one of Ahimelech's servants betrays David to King Saul, who has the priest and all his companions and family executed by the traitor who betrayed him. You might wonder why Mark gives the priest's name as Abiathar, whereas he is called Ahimelech in the Old Testament book of Samuel. In fact, the book of Samuel tells us Abiathar was the son of Ahimelech, who escaped execution and joined David and his band of rebels. Abiathar tells David that Saul had killed his father Ahimelech and all their family. Either Mark or Jesus himself got the wrong name in their telling of the story. Matthew and Luke in their Gospels refrain from mentioning the priest's name. The third of our stories this week follows on from the previous two. Jesus attends the Jewish synagogue, as he usually did, on another Sabbath soon after the previous incident. He calls forward a man who has a crippled arm, and the Pharisees watch to see if Jesus would heal the man on the Sabbath. In their understanding, God rested on the Sabbath. So if Jesus healed someone on the Sabbath, it must be by some other agency and not an act of God's power. Jesus notices the challenge in their gaze focused on him to see whether he would submit to their traditional understanding of the Jewish law and wait for another occasion, or whether Jesus would heal the man even on the Sabbath. Jesus is angry with them. He grieves the hardness of their hearts that claims to put the law of God above the love of God. Following his previous statement about the Sabbath being for man's good, Jesus challenges them whether it is lawful to do good or harm on the Sabbath, whether one should save life or kill. The Pharisees decline to answer. They have already put the law above everything else, even God himself. Jesus heals the man in front of their eyes, and instead of praising God, they leave the synagogue and gather together to figure out how to destroy Jesus. They condemn a good act of Jesus and plot to carry out a killing specifically against the sixth of the 10 Commandments. You shall not kill. Jesus was angry. Did you notice that? Often we think that Jesus was only ever angry at the temple in the week before he was executed on the cross, when he turned over the tables of the money chambers and drove all the traders out of the temple. He was angry at the barriers that people had erected that took advantage of people coming to worship God. Here he is being angry at those who cling to the laws and traditions of the past, when they objected to Jesus bringing healing to one of their people on the Sabbath, on the Lord's Day. How often is God angry with us for putting tradition before opportunity to bring someone a blessing? How often is he angry with us for not telling someone about Jesus when the opportunity arises? How often is he angry with us when we tell him that something is too difficult for us? Have you ever read the verse in John's Gospel, chapter 14, when Jesus tells his disciples that they would do even greater things than he did? How dare we tell God to find someone else because he couldn't enable us to do what he asked us to do? Come on. How weak do you think God is? Are you so certain? How are you so certain that God couldn't do through you what he tells you to do? I can't tell you how often people have said to me in the past, even long before I became a minister myself, "Oh, I couldn't possibly do that." Was their weakness greater than God's strength? He made the entire universe out of nothing, just by speaking the word. He breathed his life into the earth, and chemicals lived. His son was executed, broken and bleeding, lifeless, dead and buried. On the third day, God raised him from death. What is it, you think, that is too hard for God? How dare we belittle his greatness? We should be ashamed. Am I angry too? Well, yes, I am. But I also have compassion because I know what it is like. I am with you because so often I tell God, surely not. You can't mean me to do that, surely. No one will believe me. I shall make a fool of myself. I too am ashamed. Jesus knows how hard it is. He himself went through the Garden of Gethsemane when he could have run away from the cross. Instead, he submitted to God, but not before tears of blood fell from his face. What is the answer? We need to open our hearts to the greatness of God. He is no less now than when he gave Jesus the power to do all these things. He is the same God now, who enabled the followers of Jesus in the early church to do these mighty deeds. Today, if we will open our ears, open our hearts, and say yes to God, then we will see and know his greatness in our lives, in our communities, and in our nation. I say to God, yes. What do you say? Amen.